Good afternoon po, ma'am and sir. We are the Group 3 from Grade 12 STEM po. First of all, we conduct this research because in the midst of the pandemic, there are many issues and conflicts with the nurses and in their works. So we, the researchers, wanted to seek for their satisfactions. So we titled our research, Working Conditions of Nurses and Their Satisfaction Amidst Pandemic, a Descriptive Study.
Hello, I'm Escoto Julius Ivan Matthew.
I am Gambawa Mark Angelo M.
I'm Gutierrez Rovic Yuji.
I'm Jacobe Raymart B.
Magbanwa Brian Gabriel G.
And I'm Sikat James Carl B.
And we are the researchers and the proponents of this study. And let's begin with chapter 1. The problem and its related literature. Let's begin with the introduction. First, trends. The Philippines is suffering from the COVID-19. There have been almost 37,000 deaths from 2.4 or almost 2.4 million confirmed cases of the COVID-19 or the virus as of January 2020 to September 2021. Even though the Philippines is adjusting the time because there have been a total of almost 38 million vaccine doses that have been distributed that time, and it is all based from the World Health Organization in 2021. And let's start with the issues. The main issue in this study or in this pandemic is that the nurses' works are getting bigger and harder, and then they are only getting low salaries and benefits, and they are not really supported by the government. And it is based by CHIA in 2020-2021. The objectives and contributions of the study the study hope to determine the description of the satisfaction of the nurses when they are encountering their working conditions during the pandemic.
So for our SOP naman po, in accordance to our variables, we hope to answer the following research question. Number 1, how can the condition of the nurses be described in terms of number of working hours per day, number of length of their health service, hospital ownership type, amount of salary? Number 2, what is the level of the satisfaction of the nurses? And for the number 3, what is the description of the satisfaction of the nurses when they're encountering their working conditions during the pandemic?
And let's begin with the related literature. We have two variables: independent variable, which is the nurses' working conditions, and the dependent variable, which is the nurses' job satisfaction during the pandemic. And let's begin. First of all, what is a nurse? Nurse is a person who works in healthcare who have the responsibility of protecting and improving the health of their communities or patients. And let's begin with their sub-problems. Number of working hours. The average shift of the nurses' working hours in the pandemic is 8 to 12 hours. And it is all based from Joseph 2016 and Sarah of 2018. And for the length of service, as stated by PayScale in 2021, that a nurse can earn 150,000 if they have 1 to 4 years of experience. And a nurse with 5 to 9 years of experience can earn 200,000 pesos per year.
So as for the hospital ownership type po and salary, the amount of salaries that nurses receive depends on the hospital and their position as nurses. For example, as said by Rovic first, an article from PayScale in 2021 implies that nurses with less experience receives lower salary rate compared to those who have more experience. However, speaking from Mr. Ebesate's statement, nurses from public hospitals are paid more than the ones working in private. And for their satisfaction, Legaspi in 2019 said that both nurses working in public and private have the same general average of satisfaction.
And for the framework of the related literature, we have here two boxes. First for the independent variable, and the second box is for the dependent variable. And as you can see in the middle, there is a line with doesn't have arrow in its edges or endings because this framework symbolizes that this is a descriptive study.
Moving on to the related theories regarding our research. Starting with bargaining theory, Kleinswerd 2018 explained that wage bargaining theory state that wage, hours, and working conditions are determined by the parties' relative negotiation strength. When there's a pandemic, it makes sense for nurses to get more money because of the risk they face on the job. This will later lead to the efficiency wage theory. The theory itself encourages employers to raise the level of money that they pay their workers. It also promotes higher salaries for workers to help them focus and stay on the job despite their current situation. According to Simpson 2018, The general reasoning behind this theory is that if workers are paid more than the so-called market equilibrium, their morale will be boosted, thus motivating them to display better performance. And this eventually resulted in the desired theory. Happiness is about someone getting what they want. Griffin 1986. This is all about a person wanting pleasure without or with little pain. Moving on to the scope and the limitation. What will we do? We will do a data gathering. We will do a data gathering to whom? Nurses are our respondents. Where are these nurses located? They are found in the hospitals of Bulacan. When or what is the duration of the data gathering? We conducted the data gathering from December 2021 to March 2022.
Significance of the study. Chief nursing officers would have a deeper level of understanding of the description of the satisfaction of the nurses when they are encountering their working conditions during the pandemic. For the DOH, since DOH is also concerned with the condition of nurses during the pandemic, this study will assist them assessing the condition and satisfaction of nurses during the pandemic. For the government officials, the degree of healthcare workers' condition has an impact on the salary. This research will assist the government in determining whether healthcare and professional salary should be increased. Respondents or nurses will be aware of the description of the satisfaction of the nurses. The future researchers, they could use this study as a reference for their own research.
It's vocabulary time. Pandemic. This is the widespread of a disease throughout the continent, country, or the world. Nurse. Someone that's employed in the medical field accompanied by a doctor. COVID-19. This refers to a pulmonary disease that is extremely infectious. Satisfaction is the feeling of happiness an individual feels when it gets or does something that it wanted to have or do.
So moving on to the chapter 2 of our research paper, research methodology. So our research method po is descriptive survey research method. Since we are dealing mostly with survey forms containing close-ended questions. This method po allows us to gather large amounts of data.
Sampling techniques. Our research group utilized the convenient sampling method for various reasons. First, the nurses in this pandemic were busy and they were likely to have spare time to answer our questionnaire. Second, the nurses right now are hard to approach due to the dangerous environment they work in. And lastly, the nurses would rather spend the spare time to their families or perhaps rest. This is why we choose the convenient sampling method because we can be specific and select to what available nurses we can inquire to answer our questionnaires as long as they live in Bulacan province.
So for the ethical consideration, we make a letter of approval that has been given to the respondents as we gather the data. The participants also have the right to approve and withdraw their participation as their personal information and knowledge are involved in this data gathering. And last, their identity is anonymous to give protection to the personal information of the participants. After we had their approvals, they can now respond to our survey through hard copy questionnaires to face-to-face situation and Google Forms for online.
And now let's begin with the statistical treatments. First, we have the frequency. And second, we have the percentage. And as you can see that in the formula percentage, that frequency and percentage are related in each other, where P is equal to percent, F is equal to frequency, and N is equal to the total number of respondents. And third, we have the weighted mean. As you can see that our formula for the weighted mean is not the general formula because we use the weighted mean for searching for the satisfaction, level of satisfaction, as you can see. Next. After gathering the weighted mean, we can now describe the weighted mean through Likert scale if it is very satisfied, satisfied, dissatisfied, and very dissatisfied. And for the range, we use range because you know that numbers are infinite and endless. So to limit the numbers, we can use range, just like what we have used it in our options in our questions for our questionnaire.
So for the description of the respondents, for Malolo San Vicente Hospital, there are 1 respondents, 5%. For the Sacred Heart, there are 8 respondents, 40%. And for the Bulacan Medical Center, there are 10 respondents, 50%. For the Megawayan Doctor Hospital and Medical Center, 1 respondent, 5%. And their total sample population is 20 respondents, or 100%.
So moving on po to the final part of our research paper with Chapter 3, Presentation, Analysis, and Interpretation of Data, along with Chapter 4, Results, Conclusion, and Recommendations.
Sub-problems. 1.1. How can the condition of the nurses be described in terms of the number of working hours per day? According to our data, 70 to 85% of respondents work for 9 to 12 hours per day, while 2 or 10% work for 13 to 18 hours per day. Only about 1 to 5% of the respondents work between 1 and 8 hours per day. 85% of nurses work beyond the recommended working hours. World Health Organization or WHO cited a variety of factors as contributing to nurse being overworked during this pandemic, including extended work hours, high level of stress, and difficult working conditions. As the researchers, we therefore concluded that the nurses during this pandemic worked more hours beyond the average working hours. Sub-problem 1.2. How can the condition of the nurses be described in terms of the length of their health services? Based on our gathered data, 10 or 50% of participants work for 19 to 24 months. Meanwhile, 5 or 25% work for 13 to 18 months. At the same time, 5 or 25% of the respondents work for 17 to 12 months during the epidemic. Nurses in the Philippines work on an average of 19 to 24 months because they are required to work in the public sector during this pandemic. According to YAP, the government intends to strengthen the local health system in the light of recent spiking coronavirus cases. We therefore concluded that the majority of nurses in the Philippines continue to work throughout the pandemic.
Sub-problem 1.3. How can the condition of the nurses be described in terms of hospital ownership type? As you can see in the data, it shows that 10 or 50% of the nurses were working in public and also 10 or 50% work in private hospitals. This explains that there is no exception for nurses to not even work if they work in public or private. This conclude that public and private hospitals have almost equal number of nurses in the Philippines. Sub-problem 1.4. How can the condition of the nurses be described in terms of amount of salary? As you can see, the result revealed that 7 or 35% of the respondents had a 21 to 25,000 monthly income during the pandemic. 6 or 30% had 16 to 20,000 monthly income. 6 or 30% had 11 to 15,000 monthly income, and only 1 or 5% had 5 to 10,000 monthly income. This data shows that the majority of the nurses had higher income during the pandemic. This conclude that most of the nurses have large working incomes despite of the pandemic.
So, sub-problem number 2, what is the level of the nurses' satisfaction? So, prior to this po, there's an article from Legazpi in 2019 where he stated that nurses working in private and public hospitals has a general average satisfaction level. This is proven po as our study found out that nurses in Bulacan has a general satisfaction. We conclude po na nurses are satisfied with their overall condition and they're happy with their jobs.
To answer the sub-problem number 3, what is the description of the satisfaction of the nurses when they're encountering their working conditions during the pandemic? And let's begin with number of working hours. So as you can see in the table po, the table revealed that during the pandemic, nurses working to 1 to 8 hours are satisfied with weighted mean of 2.85. And the nurses working for 9 to 12 hours and 13 to 18 hours are dissatisfied. And their weighted means are 2.45 and 2.30. To conclude that nurses do not want to work over the limits and they don't want to work over the normal working hours.
Next is the working condition based on length of service. The table revealed that nurses with service length ranging from 13 to 18 months are satisfied with a weighted mean of 2.52, and nurses with service length ranging from 7 to 12 months and 19 to 24 months are dissatisfied with a weighted mean of 2.48 and 2.49. We conclude that nurses who work at the beginning of the pandemic and nurses who are new to the profession understand the difficulty of the job. They are finding it very difficult to work since they are still innovating.
And let's go now to the satisfaction of the nurses per hospital ownership type they work for. As you can see, the table shows that the respondents, private and public nurses, are satisfied, but not fully satisfied and not dissatisfied because their weighted means are 2.55 and 2.56, which are very close to the last number, 2.50, of the dissatisfied range or option 2 in the Likert scale when we go back. This demonstrates that some Filipino nurses or in Bulacan were satisfied with their work. Private and public nurses are not quite different now because of their workloads and satisfaction. And both private and public nurses are suffering during the pandemic.
Moving on to working condition based on salary. The table revealed that nurses who earn 5,000 to 10,000 a month and 16,000 to 20,000 a month are dissatisfied, while nurses who earn 11,000 to 15,000 a month and 21,000 to 25,000 a month are satisfied. We conclude that nurses' satisfaction with their salary is influenced not just by money, but also by workloads and other factors.
In accordance to our conclusions, we, the researchers, listed the following recommendations. For the government official, it will be more beneficial for the nurses, private and public, to have an increase in their salaries or compensation. It will serve as a gift for them despite their daily hard work and sacrifices in dealing with virus and curing the patients during the pandemic.
Private and public hospitals must hire many employed nurses during the pandemic because the workloads and working hours of the employed nurses are over the limit that is making them suffer in their job. So, for the nurses that are still not working during the pandemic, it could help the struggling nurses, the Filipinos, by volunteering or accepting the medical works and services during pandemic.
For the Department of Health and Nurses, every nurse who has worked throughout the whole duration of the pandemic deserves a break or rest after the pandemic.
Many rude comments are being received by the nurses during the pandemic. Commuters and drivers were getting rid of them to avoid the virus which can be carried by the nurses, but they don't know that they are sanitizing themselves after their work. Nurses deserve to be treated in a nice way because they are our workers who cure or heal the Filipinos.
So for our last recommendation, to the future researchers that wants to study satisfaction of the nurses in the Philippines, we suggest po in order to improve the study that they use more respondents and a probability sampling technique when the pandemic is gone, since we as researchers now have limited time and respondents po. So once again, we are group 3 po from STEM 4.
And we succeeded for seeking for the description of the satisfaction of the nurses when they're encountering their working conditions during the pandemic. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you
Thank
po.
Thank you po.